Courage begins where certainty ends, because certainty is the comfort zone we build around ourselves to avoid the risk of being wrong, rejected, or vulnerable. And yet life is never guaranteed, never scripted, never as neat as we imagine it will be, which means that the real threshold of growth always sits at the edge of the unknown, demanding that we step without a map and trust that our feet will find ground. When we cling to certainty, we keep ourselves trapped in patterns we've outgrown, replaying the same days, conversations, and choices, convincing ourselves that safety is more valuable than possibility. But the truth is that safety without movement eventually feels like suffocation. And it's only when we allow ourselves to walk into uncertainty that we unlock the strength, resilience, and creativity we never knew we had. Because courage is not the absence of fear. It's the willingness to act in spite of it, the willingness to speak when our voice shakes, to try when success is not promised, to love when loss is possible, and to dream when failure might happen. And while certainty tries to lull us with the promise of stability, it also hides the fact that nothing alive is truly certain, not the path, not the outcome, not even the people beside us. And so the paradox is that by clinging to certainty, we lose what we crave the most, meaning, growth, transformation, and connection, whereas courage, though terrifying, is what expands us, tests us, and ultimately shows us what we are capable of enduring and creating. And if we look back on our lives, the moments that shaped us most were rarely the ones where everything was predictable. They were the times we walked into the unknown, trembling but willing, and discovered that we could survive, adapt, and even thrive. And this matters because when we delay courage, waiting for certainty to appear, we end up waiting forever, as certainty is an illusion, a mirage that shifts just as we approach it, leaving us stuck in preparation mode instead of in living mode. And so courage asks us to act without guarantee, to leap without knowing if the net will appear, to trust that even if we stumble we will learn, to believe that the act of trying is itself a victory. And the beauty of this truth is that courage is contagious. Once we taste it, once we survive that first uncertain leap, we realize that we are more capable than we imagined, and it fuels us to keep stepping further, building a life not defined by what was certain, but by what was possible. And though fear will always whisper that we are not ready, that failure will be too heavy, that rejection will crush us, courage insists that our lives are worth the risk, that who we might become is worth more than the illusion of who we are now. And so courage becomes the bridge to transformation, the moment where the known ends and the unknown begins, the point where we feel our hearts racing and our palms sweating but choose to move anyway. And in that movement we begin to redefine not just what we are capable of, but what it means to live fully, because the richest experiences of being alive do not come wrapped in certainty. They come when we dare to step into mystery, when we embrace the possibility of falling as much as the possibility of flying, when we stop rehearsing and finally begin living. And each act of courage, no matter how small, accumulates, building a reservoir of confidence, reminding us again and again that the end of certainty is not the end of safety, but the beginning of freedom. And the only way to honor the life we've been given is to step into that freedom with an open heart, trembling hands, and the conviction that the unknown is not our enemy, but our invitation. Small shifts create big transformations, because real change is rarely the product of a single grand gesture or dramatic overhaul, but instead the accumulation of consistent, intentional choices that, while seemingly insignificant in the moment, compound over time to reshape the entire trajectory of our lives. And often we overlook these moments because they don't feel monumental. They don't make us feel like heroes in the moment. Yet if you pause and trace the arc of your own growth, you'll notice that what led you to the person you are today were the tiny adjustments, the subtle redirections, the decisions to take one step instead of standing still. And the truth is that transformation is not an event, but a process, a series of nudges that gradually shift our habits, our mindset, and our identity. And we forget that a single degree of difference in direction eventually alters an entire destination, like a ship that leaves the harbor slightly off course, but after miles at sea ends up in an entirely different country. And in our own lives, those slight adjustments in thought, routine, or belief can carry us somewhere we never imagined. Yet we resist because the human mind craves quick results. We want the big leap, the overnight success, the dramatic before and after story, when in reality the power lies in showing up for the micro. Moments that don't feel like much but quietly rewire us for something greater, because change is built in repetition, and repetition builds identity, and identity builds destiny, and when we learn to honor the small shifts, we stop underestimating the power of the present moment. For every time we choose differently today, we teach ourselves that transformation is within reach, that we are capable of growth, that even if we cannot move mountains, we can pick up one stone, and that matters, because moving stones consistently eventually reshapes the landscape, and what once felt immovable becomes a place we've already walked across. And when we tell ourselves it has to be big to matter, we paralyze ourselves into waiting, but when we accept that small shifts are enough, we unlock the freedom to begin now, and it might be as simple as choosing to listen instead of interrupt, to wake up 10 minutes earlier, to replace one excuse with one act of accountability, to replace one moment of judgment with one moment of compassion, and over time these tiny shifts create a life that feels radically different, not because we turned it upside down in one day, but because we invested in tiny choices over countless days. And in doing so, we discover that transformation is less about pressure and more about presence, less about force and more about alignment. And the beauty is that small shifts don't just transform outcomes. They transform how we see ourselves, because with each small step we gather proof that we are capable of change, that we are not trapped in who we were yesterday, and that belief becomes the seed of greater courage, greater consistency, and greater freedom. And perhaps the greatest reminder in all of this is that the small shifts are always available. We don't have to wait for the stars to align. We don't need permission or perfect timing. We simply need to choose one step that aligns us with who we want to be. And when we take it, we discover that we are already transforming, already evolving, already stepping into a life that looks and feels different. And it all began not with certainty, not with perfection, not with one massive leap, but with the courage to shift something small and trust that those shifts, multiplied over time, can create the kind of transformation that feels both inevitable and miraculous. Permission is an inside job because so much of what holds us back is not the actual barriers in the world, but the belief that we need someone else to validate, approve, or endorse the choices that belong only to us. And we learn from an early age to look outward for signals that it is safe to move. Whether it is a teacher telling us we did well, a parent nodding in approval, or a friend assuring us we are good enough, and slowly that external gaze becomes the lens through which we measure our worth, leaving us paralyzed when those affirmations don't arrive. But the truth is no one else can hand us the permission slip we keep waiting for, because life is not a classroom where someone else decides if we are ready. Life is a canvas that waits for us to pick up the brush, and when we recognize this, we understand that the authority to act, to change, to pursue, to leave, to begin, has always been within us, yet we often silence ourselves by saying things like, "I can't until they support me," or "I'll be ready when they understand me." And in doing so, we hand over the keys to our own freedom, but the moment we realize that permission is not granted but chosen, we begin to reclaim the energy we've been giving away to other people's expectations, judgments, and timelines. And this reclamation is not loud or defiant at first. It can be quiet, almost imperceptible, like finally speaking the truth you've been swallowing, or taking the step you've been deferring, or allowing yourself to rest when you've been running on empty. And while the world may not clap for those moments, they are seismic because they signal that you no longer outsource your authority to voices that do not live inside your skin. And it is in this act of granting ourselves permission that we begin to see how much of our lives we've spent waiting at closed doors, hoping someone would open them instead of realizing the gate was never locked, only feared, and fear is loud, but it is not final. So when you give yourself permission, you also give yourself freedom, the freedom to create without asking if it will be accepted, to love without demanding that it be reciprocated in the exact way you imagine, to try without certainty of success, and even to fail without attaching shame to your worth, because permission at its core is about trusting that your choices matter because they are yours, not because they are stamped with someone else's approval. And when you stop waiting for permission, you stop living in the shadow of imagined disapproval, and you begin to recognize that those who might judge you are often too consumed with their own fears to even notice, which means the prison you thought you were in was often built by your own hesitation. And this is not to say that others' opinions don't sting, but rather that they no longer hold the final say, and the truth is that life is short enough that waiting becomes its own kind of surrender, because every day we wait for someone else to tell us it's okay, we are losing a day of actually living the life that could be ours. So giving yourself permission is not selfish. It is sacred. It is an act of self-respect that ripples into every part of your existence, because when you trust yourself enough to say yes to your own voice, you not only liberate yourself, you model for others that they too can stop waiting, and this creates a different kind of freedom, one that multiplies, but it must begin with you, with the quiet yet powerful decision to stop looking outward for a green light, and instead declare to yourself that the light is already green. The way is already open, and the time is already now. And once you embrace that, you stop seeking permission. Start living as though your life belongs fully to you, because it always has. Owning your story is the doorway to freedom, because so much of the weight we carry comes from trying to edit, deny, or bury the parts of ourselves we've deemed too messy, too painful, or too unworthy to be seen. And yet the very act of hiding those chapters binds us tighter to them, keeping us trapped in shame and secrecy, while freedom begins the moment we decide to stop running from our own narrative and instead face it with honesty, compassion, and courage. Because every person has moments they wish they could erase, choices that make them cringe, experiences that scarred them, but pretending those pieces don't exist doesn't protect us. It only fractures us, leaving us split between the polished version of who we present and the unspoken truth of who we are. And this gap becomes exhausting to maintain, draining the energy we could use to live fully. But when we step into the bold act of owning our story, we collapse that gap. We bring the hidden into the light, and we begin to live with integrity, not because everything is perfect, but because everything is honest, and honesty is where freedom lives. And in owning our story, we discover that the things we thought disqualified us are often the very things that connect us to others, because people don't bond over perfection, they bond over truth. And when we allow our scars to be visible, we remind others that healing is possible, which makes our story not just a weight we carried, but a bridge we built. And what once felt like weakness becomes a source of strength. Yet this ownership does not come easily, because the voices of shame will whisper that you are too broken, that people will reject you, that silence is safer. But the lie of shame is that silence keeps you safe, when in reality it keeps you small, and the only way to disarm that lie is to stop hiding and claim your story as your own, saying, yes, this happened, yes, I made those choices, yes, I carry those wounds, and yes, I am still worthy, still whole, still capable of joy. And this act of claiming does not erase the past, but it reframes it, transforming what was once a chain into a key, because the truth you own can no longer be weaponized against you. And this is where freedom blooms, not in pretending to be flawless, but in standing firm in the fact that you are imperfect and still enough. And when you do this, you stop being controlled by the fear of being found out, because there is nothing left to find out. You already stand in the open, unhidden and unashamed, and from that place, choices become clearer, relationships become more authentic, and life feels lighter, because carrying a false version of yourself is a heavy burden, and releasing it is a liberation you can feel in your body, in your breath, in your spirit. And owning your story is not about dwelling in the past, but about reclaiming the narrative so it no longer dictates your future, and in doing so, you also give yourself permission to grow beyond it, because when you own your story, you are no longer stuck in it. You are free to write the next chapter with intention rather than avoidance. And perhaps the most powerful part of this freedom is that it allows you to see yourself with compassion, to understand that the parts you once despised were also the places where you survived, adapted, and learned, and that survival is nothing to be ashamed of. It is something to honor, and as you honor it, you begin to see that your story is not a limitation but a foundation, not a cage but a launching pad, because everything you've lived through becomes material for wisdom, resilience, and connection, and the more fully you own it, the less it owns you, and the doorway to freedom swings wide open the moment you realize that your story, in all its mess and beauty, was never meant to be hidden. It was meant to be lived, embraced, and carried forward with the kind of strength that comes only from truth. Change requires both grace and grit because transformation is never a straight line. It is a winding path full of moments that test our endurance and others that test our compassion for ourselves. And without grit, we would give up the first time things get uncomfortable. Yet without grace, we would harden into perfectionism and self-criticism so severe that the journey itself would become unbearable. And these two qualities, though seemingly opposite, are actually partners in the work of growth, because grit is the steady discipline to keep showing up, to keep trying when the novelty wears off, to stay when quitting feels easier, while grace is the gentle reminder that we are human, that mistakes are not evidence of failure but proof of effort, that rest is not weakness but fuel, and together they form the balance that makes change sustainable, because relying on grit alone can drive us into burnout, into pushing ourselves so hard that we lose sight of why we started, and relying only on grace can tempt us into letting ourselves off the hook too often, excusing away the hard choices and the discipline required. But when grace and grit live side by side, we discover a rhythm that honors both resilience and compassion, strength and softness, drive and rest. And this rhythm is what allows us to endure the long seasons of change without collapsing under the weight of expectation. Because every transformation worth pursuing will come with setbacks, with failures, with days where nothing goes right, and in those moments grit keeps us from abandoning ourselves. Grit says try again, take one more step, hold steady, and grace says you are not broken for struggling, you are not behind for stumbling, you are not unworthy for being human, and when you listen to both voices, you keep moving forward with persistence but without cruelty, and this matters because change is not just about achieving an external goal. It is about becoming a person capable of sustaining that change, and that becoming requires patience as much as persistence, and patience is where grace lives, reminding us that growth takes time, that healing is not linear, that progress is often invisible until suddenly it is undeniable, and grit is what ensures we stay long enough to see that moment, to reach the point where the small daily efforts stack into transformation. And if you reflect on seasons of your life where you've truly changed, you'll notice both were present. You pushed through fear, doubt, or fatigue, but you also forgave yourself when you slipped. You gave yourself permission to keep going even when it wasn't pretty, and in doing so you learned that change is not about never falling but about refusing to stay down, and it is not about never resting but about trusting that rest is part of the process. And perhaps the greatest gift of grace and grit together is that they shift how we measure success, because instead of expecting perfection, we begin to measure progress. Instead of demanding instant results, we learn to celebrate consistency. Instead of defining ourselves by a single moment, we begin to trust the arc of effort over time. And this is liberating because it means we no longer need to wait for flawless execution to believe we are worthy of change we seek. We only need to keep showing up with effort and compassion, and the combination of those forces is unstoppable. Because grit alone can create achievement, but grace ensures that achievement does not cost us our joy. And grace alone can create peace, but grit ensures that peace is not stagnant but alive with growth. And when these two meet, change becomes not only possible but sustainable, not only external but internal, shaping not just what we do but who we become. And in that becoming we find a strength that is steady and a softness that is healing, a balance that allows us to carry the weight of transformation without breaking under it, knowing that every step, whether fueled by determination or soothed by forgiveness, is still a step forward, still part of the work, still part of the story of becoming. The future you dream of begins with one brave choice today, because everything you long for, everything you imagine yourself becoming, everything you hope your life could hold is not waiting in some distant, unreachable place, but is planted in the soil of the present moment. And too often we convince ourselves that the future is built by dramatic leaps or grand opportunities, but in truth it is born out of the small, often terrifying decision to act when fear tells us to wait, because the brave choice is rarely the easiest one. It is the one that demands we risk failure, disappointment, or discomfort in order to honor what matters most, and what makes it powerful is not its size but its direction, because the act of aligning today with what you hope for tomorrow creates momentum, and momentum compounds into transformation, yet so many of us stay paralyzed at the edge of possibility because we are waiting for certainty, for clarity, for a sign that guarantees success, and while we wait, time passes, opportunities slip, and the life we imagine drifts further away. But when we choose to be brave, even in one small way, we interrupt that cycle. We declare that the future is not something that happens to us, but something we participate in creating, and that declaration changes everything because it shifts us from being passive observers to active authors of our own story. And one choice can truly alter the trajectory of our lives, whether it is saying yes when fear screams no, speaking the truth you have hidden, leaving behind what no longer serves you, or daring to begin what you've postponed. And while the outcome of that choice may be uncertain, the act itself reshapes you, because bravery has a way of awakening parts of us that comfort keeps dormant, and every time you choose courage, you teach yourself that you are capable of more than you believed, and this inner shift is what builds the confidence to make the next brave choice, and then the next, until suddenly the gap between who you are and who you dreamed of becoming grows smaller. And this is how the future is built, not by waiting for a perfect plan, but by stacking courageous moments, one upon the other, until they form a path. And the truth is that no future worth living is built without risk, without uncertainty, without the willingness to step forward trembling. Because dreams are not destinations we stumble into. They are destinations we move toward through decisions that feel costly in the moment, but prove invaluable over time. And if you look back on the times in your life where you grew the most, it was likely not when things were easy or certain, but when you chose to do something that scared you, that stretched you, that demanded you trust yourself more than your fear. And those choices, however small they seemed, became turning points, and the same is true for the future you long for now. It will not come closer through wishing or waiting. It will come closer the moment you do the one thing today that aligns with it, even if it feels insignificant to others, because significance is not measured by applause but by alignment, by the way a choice pulls you closer to your true self. And once you step into that kind of bravery, you begin to see that the future is not a far-off horizon, but a living thing you are shaping every single day. And the question becomes not whether you will reach it, but whether you are willing to begin, because one brave choice today may not change your whole life instantly, but it will change you, and when you change, your life begins to follow, unfolding in directions that once seemed impossible, but are now inevitable, because you decided to stop waiting for tomorrow and start building it with the courage of today.